I don't even know where to start. This happened about 3 months ago, and to this day I can't get that image out of my head. I was making a delivery on a rural road, very far away, close to one of those isolated areas where, if you don't know where you're going, you easily end up getting lost. I always like to stop in places like this, in those spots where the view is open and the silence is so thick that you can even hear the wind. That's where I found her. She appeared out of nowhere. I was lying on the seat of the truck, drinking some water, already a little tired from the road and the endless kilometers. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a small woman walking toward me. No big deal, right? But what surprised me was the white coat she was wearing. She didn't appear to be a doctor or anyone who would normally wear a lab coat. It was all covered in blood. And the woman, with a blank expression, looked more lost than anything else. She asked me if I knew where a lake was nearby. Something about a deer run over. I stood there, without reacting, because, I don't know, no one had ever asked me something like that. The way she spoke to me made me uncomfortable. The woman seemed too fragile to do anything related to that type of work. The lake she mentioned was a good 30 minutes away, and I couldn't quite understand what she wanted with it. But what made my hair stand on end the most was the tone of her voice. It was monotonous, as if she was repeating something that didn't make sense to her. I tried not to look scared, but a strange feeling was taking over me. I looked at her coat once again, thinking that it could be an accident scene or something serious, but nothing made sense. When I asked why she needed to go to the lake, the woman just replied that she had to remove the deer. The way she said that, it didn't sound like someone who was resolving an emergency. It was as if this were any task, without urgency. That blood on the coat? It didn't just look like blood from a car accident. It was different, denser, as if it were something very recent. When the woman moved to fix her hair, I noticed that her fingers were covered in something that didn't look like just blood. It was a sticky substance. That's when I started to realize that the situation wasn't right, but it was too late to change the direction of the conversation. She looked me in the eyes, and only then did I realize that there was no longer any kind of sparkle there. I don't know what made me keep talking to her, but something about that situation was stopping me from just walking away. I should have realized before, but only now, as I write this, that my head was full of unnecessary doubts and worries. The silence between us became awkward. I was waiting for a reaction from her, some sign that it all made sense, but it didn't happen. She just stood there, staring at me. The feeling of discomfort grew with every second, as if the surrounding atmosphere was becoming heavier. That's when she asked for help to get to the lake. She talked about the deer again, and something in her manner made me swallow hard. I got up and, on an impulse that I can't explain, said that I could help her get to the lake, but something in me was already questioning why I was doing this. I looked around and the road was completely empty. No car had passed for at least half an hour. The woman didn't seem to care about that. She continued talking about the deer, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. As if it were a daily service that she performed. I tried to ask her what she meant by remove, but she didn't respond. He just shook his head, as if he was searching for words, but to no avail. Her response came abruptly, without emotion. I just need to remove the deer, that's all. Fear began to take over me completely, but at the same time, I still couldn't get out of there. I was so stuck in that situation, like something was holding me in place. I looked down the path and noticed that there was no sign of where she had come from, and, even stranger, no footprints or cars. She seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. I tried to look at the sky, try to find some explanation for what was happening. But everything was very quiet, as if the world had stopped at that moment. The wind had died down and the heat from the road didn't help at all. I knew something wasn't right, but still, my feet wouldn't move. She then approached my truck and looked inside, with blank curiosity in her eyes. I don't know what she wanted, but being so close to me made me take a step back, as if I was somehow responsible for something she couldn't understand. She still wasn't looking at me directly, but rather over her shoulder, as if she were observing something on the horizon. I began to wonder if she knew something I didn't, or if, perhaps, she was in a very altered state of mind. When she touched the glass, it was almost as if she forced my mind to focus on her, and in that moment I realized there was no turning back. I should have left, but I couldn't. I was about to get in the truck and drive away, but then she said something that made me freeze. "You saw the deer, didn't you? He's waiting by the lake." I didn't know what she meant by that. I didn't see anything on the road, not before, not after, and the strangest thing was that she seemed so sure of what she was saying. I felt my stomach drop, and something in my body just panicked, wanting to run away. I don't know if it was her tone, or the way she looked off into the distance, as if she were talking to someone I couldn't see. Like I was in the middle of something I shouldn't be seeing. Still, I continued there, standing next to the truck, unable to do anything. The woman hadn't moved, not once, and it seemed like time was standing still. It was then that she began to walk, slowly, towards the field. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. Something prevented me from simply turning my back and going on my way. I looked around, as if searching for some kind of sign, a reason to act, but nothing appeared. The woman began to walk away, with that blood-stained coat flapping in the light wind that was now emerging. And, somewhere in those last words she said, I was already wondering if there was something wrong with her. I know this sounds insane, but the truth is that I was so uncomfortable, so scared, that all I wanted at that moment was to understand what was happening, to understand that strange enigma that she seemed to be. I started to walk behind her, but didn't have the courage to get close. She was heading towards the field, as if she knew exactly where she was going. I just didn't know what was beyond that point, what she really wanted. And, most importantly, why was she alone, so peaceful in such an isolated place, in such a disturbing state? When I got to the edge of the field, I saw something on the ground. I don't know if I actually saw it or if it was just my mind playing tricks, but there were marks on the ground that looked like they had been left by something very heavy. That's when I saw, in the distance, a dark silhouette, right behind the woman, close to where she was walking. Whatever it was there. I looked again, and this time I could see more clearly. It wasn't a deer. It was nothing I could recognize. My heart started pounding and the feeling of ice running down my spine was so intense that I could barely breathe. The woman then stopped. She didn't look back, but I felt like she knew exactly what was happening, like she was testing me in some way. And at that moment, I knew something terrible was happening there. Something I shouldn't have seen. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching the scene from afar, not knowing what to do. She didn't turn around. The silhouette, now clearer, seemed to move slowly, but I couldn't make out what it was. It was as if the air itself was trying to trap me there. I tried to scream, to call someone, but my voice seemed stuck in my throat. The woman continued forward, without hesitation, without looking back. The silhouette, wasn't touching her, but it seemed to be following her steps, with an absurd calm. As if they were in harmony. I know what I saw doesn't make sense. Not now. But at that moment, all I wanted was to get out of there as quickly as possible. I took a few steps back, without taking my eyes off the woman. I knew that if I looked at the silhouette again, something more horrible would happen. That was when, suddenly, the woman disappeared. I'm not talking about her leaving my field of vision. She simply disappeared. Out of nowhere. as if the wind itself had swallowed her. I frantically looked around, trying to understand what had happened, but found nothing. Not the woman, not the silhouette, not the lake, nothing. The field was empty, as if that moment had never existed. I got back to the truck as quickly as I could, my heart racing and my mind completely in pieces. I still don't know what happened there. I don't know if it was a hallucination, if I was so tired that my brain played tricks, or if, somehow, that woman wasn't real. But what I saw, what I felt, that was real. And to this day, I don't know what that silhouette was. I don't know what she wanted. I just know that since that day, whenever I pass that stretch of road, a feeling of dread comes over me, and I wonder if the woman is still there, waiting, somewhere we can't see. I always thought those lonely nights on the road, with the constant sound of the engine, were just part of the job. I was returning from a long trip in the interior of the United States, on a deserted and endless road, with the clock showing more than 3 in the morning. The sky was completely closed, and silence seemed to swallow everything around me. The radio was out of tune, which only made the feeling of loneliness even more intense. I was already used to this stillness, but that night, something seemed different, and I couldn't explain why. Then the phone rang, interrupting this deep silence, and that's when my night turned into a nightmare. It was Rick, a fellow truck driver, and from the way he started talking, I already knew something was very wrong. He was panicking, speaking quickly and having difficulty breathing, and soon told me, in slurred words, that the brakes on his truck had failed. He was going at an absurd speed going down a steep hill, and it seemed like everything was out of control. I never imagined that a mechanical error could generate so much fear in someone. The tone of desperation in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. He said he tried everything, but he no longer had control over the truck. And he was still about 200 kilometers away from me. I tried to make some suggestion, to say something to reassure him, but there was no way. He was already shouting, and I could only hear parts of the sentence. There's no way, the slope, it's never ending. He was desperate. When I realized he could no longer hear me properly, his words began to become a jumble of nonsense, until suddenly the phone cut off. The silence in my truck was oppressive. It was no longer the silence of the road, but that cold emptiness that leaves you when you know something really bad is about to happen. I tried calling back, but it only got voicemail. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and the worst part was that I knew that, somehow, there was nothing I could do. What happened next was like a horror movie that you know is going to end badly, but you can't leave the room. I was trying to focus on the road, trying to continue down the path, but my mind was elsewhere. Rick was still outside, with the truck out of control and panic taking over him. I felt a tightness in my chest, and with every kilometer I covered, the fear only increased. I knew he was on an endless descent, one of those roads that stretches until it disappears into the horizon. The adrenaline started to rise, but it wasn't because of the speed. It was because of the anguish of not being able to help and the feeling that something catastrophic was about to happen. The minutes passed like hours, and even with the radio silent and the road empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I thought about Rick, I imagined what he was facing back there, and every second that passed made me more uneasy. The silence I felt in the truck felt like a constant pressure, as if the road, the night and everything around me were waiting for something. The phone was still out of range, and with each new ring, my heart raced faster. I tried to ignore what was happening, but that feeling that something horrible was about to happen was impossible to shake. I just wanted to know if he was okay, but I knew that road wouldn't give me any answers. That was when, suddenly, a bang behind me made me jump out of the seat. The sound of a strong impact, as if a train had hit something solid. My body froze and, without thinking, I glanced in the rearview mirror. What I saw was something I will never forget. A huge column of fire rising into the sky, lighting up the road for a few seconds. It was Rick's truck. Something went terribly wrong. The smell of burning began to invade the air, and the sight of the explosion left me paralyzed for a few seconds. Whatever he was trying to do, it hadn't worked. Fear turned into panic, and I knew I needed to go back, even though I didn't know what I could do. Without thinking, I made a risky maneuver and started back on the road, accelerating as much as I could. The thought that consumed me was that, if Rick had survived, maybe he was trying to save himself somehow. I had no idea what to expect, but I needed to try. I knew the explosion meant his truck was completely destroyed, but what about him? What happened to Rick? I needed an answer. I needed to make sure he was still alive, but with every meter I advanced, the strange feeling that it was already too late became stronger. The road seemed endless, and the fear increased with every turn I made. When I finally arrived at the location, the view was even worse than I imagined. The truck was partially buried in a huge crater, at least 15 meters deep, as if the explosion had created a hole in the ground itself. The fire had already gone out, but smoke was still rising, and the smell of burning fuel filled the air. I stood there, motionless, trying to process everything. I didn't know if Rick had managed to save himself or if the worst had happened. And before I could get any closer, I saw something that scared me even more. There was no sign of Rick. No trace of him anywhere, nothing to suggest he had left the truck before the explosion. The silence in that place was chilling. I approached the crater with my heart pounding, and each step felt heavier than the last. The smell of burning was permeating the air, but what really scared me was the absence of any sign of Rick. No trace of him, not on the ground, not near the truck, nothing. As if he had simply disappeared. The only thing that remained of that disaster was the mark of the explosion on the ground and the icy emptiness that took over everything around me. There was no way to ignore the feeling that something was wrong, something far beyond a simple accident. As I stood there, trying to understand what had happened, I heard a sound coming from the direction of the truck. It wasn't loud at all, but enough to make me stop and turn around. My blood ran cold instantly. I thought it was the sound of Rick, or maybe some remnant of life coming from the truck, but it wasn't. It was the sound of something much more disturbing. A soft whisper, coming from inside the crater. It wasn't a human voice, but a presence that seemed to be there, waiting for me to come closer. The feeling of being watched took over me, and I could no longer sit still. Something told me that I needed to get out of there, and quickly. I decided to leave as quickly as possible. I turned my back on the crater and ran back to the truck, but deep down I knew I wouldn't be able to erase what I had seen. Whatever had happened to Rick, he wasn't there anymore. And I didn't want to know anymore either. When I got into the truck and started the engine, I stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand if I had really seen what I saw. When I looked in the rearview mirror for a brief second, I swore I saw a figure in the smoke. It wasn't Rick, but someone, something. I couldn't say. I didn't want to know. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know why Rick's truck exploded like it did, or why he disappeared without a trace. All I know is that, to this day, that night haunts me. Whenever I'm on the road, the sound of his call still echoes in my head. And, to this day, I don't know what that whisper in the crater was. All I can say is that I never went back to that road. No matter how hard I tried, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, never went away. And honestly, I don't know if it ever will. It was one of those nights when the road seems to stretch into infinity. I was driving alone, with no one around, and the truck's lights cut through the darkness in an almost lonely way. I was on one of those country roads, one of those that goes through nothing. The company had sent me that way, and I knew I wouldn't see a human being for hours. The sound of the engine was constant, a kind of repetitive music, and the monotony of the trip was beginning to affect me. That's when I saw him, there in the middle of the road. An elderly man with white hair raising his hand asking for a ride. His image was a solitary point in the middle of all that darkness. I knew that the company's policy was clear: if it was possible to help, always stop to give a ride. I looked around, there wasn't another living soul for a mile. The man seemed more like a shadow, his outlines erased by the endless night. I stopped the truck with the handbrake and opened the window. He didn't seem to mind the coldness of the morning, nor the biting wind. When he entered, he looked at me with a smile that, at the time, seemed friendly, but then it gave me goosebumps. I couldn't understand why, but something about him made me defensive. Maybe it was just the solitude of that road or the fact that it was too late, but a strange feeling remained in the air. The man started talking soon after settling down. At first, it seemed like just any conversation, things about how he was going to visit an old friend, something very simple. But as the road unfolded, I started to notice some uncomfortable details. He spoke slowly, as if he were pondering each word. There was something in his eyes, a strange gleam, as if he had already seen more than he should have. I felt uncomfortable, but at the same time, I didn't want to be rude. With his every word, I began to question myself about who he really was and what he was doing there, in the middle of nowhere, on that road. But he didn't say anything. I just drove, trying to ignore the rising tension in the air. Silence fell after a while. He stopped talking and started looking out the window, as if he were somewhere else, as if nothing there was real. Until he said, almost as if he had forgotten something, that it needed to be left in an isolated spot, further on. I didn't question it. After all, he was the one who knew best where he was going. The road was empty, and it seemed to make sense. The feeling that something was wrong was already there, but I didn't want to be the kind of person to deny an old man a ride, especially since he looked so frail. I stepped on the gas and followed his instructions, ignoring the growing feeling that all this shouldn't be happening. The road became even more isolated. I was starting to wonder if I had made a mistake, and then he asked me to turn right, at a point where there was no sign of life. Everything was so quiet that the sound of tires on the ground seemed the only noise in that lost corner of the world. There was nothing there but trees and a dirt road that seemed to disappear into the darkness. He looked completely comfortable, as if he had been there before. As if he knew exactly what to do, as if this were his place. He asked me to stop right in the middle of the road, where visibility was almost zero. I hesitated, but did as he asked. The truck braked, and I stood still, waiting for something else. The man didn't say anything, just opened the passenger side door and got out calmly, without rushing. He didn't seem to be afraid of anything. When he closed the door, a strange feeling came over me. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, maybe some farewell gesture, but he just started walking, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow. I stood there, still, trying to understand what was happening. The clock on the dashboard ticked down to a few minutes, but it felt like time had stopped. Something was wrong, very wrong. A feeling of anguish took over me, and, before I could react, the man disappeared completely. There was no sign of him anymore, not even the sounds of footsteps, nothing. Just a frightening emptiness. I looked everywhere, but there was nothing. The only sound was the wind passing through the trees. The man had disappeared in an impossible way, without leaving any trace of his presence. At that moment, a shiver ran down my spine. I knew I should leave, but something kept me there, sitting in the driver's seat. I tried to start the truck's engine, but it wouldn't start. This made the feeling of restlessness worse. My mind tried to understand what had happened. How could he have disappeared so quickly? I looked at the road in front of me, and the only movement was that of the trees swaying gently in the wind. I was overcome by a feeling of dread. The man, that stranger, seemed to have disappeared as if he had never existed. Only then, with my mind still in shock, was I able to start the truck and get out of there as quickly as I could. I didn't know what had happened, but the feeling that something was completely wrong persisted. The road seemed even longer as I drove, and the wind was blowing hard, creating a disturbing sound that mixed with the roar of the engine. The clock seemed to be stopped, and the strange feeling that something was watching me only increased. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence, that this man was just someone lost, someone who needed help. But deep down, something told me that I was involved in something I couldn't understand. A few more kilometers passed until, finally, the road opened up to a brighter area. I saw some distant lights ahead, and that gave me a little relief. The fear was turning into indescribable tiredness. I just wanted to finish the trip and forget everything that had happened. As I passed the gas station and the small town nearby, I took a deep breath, trying to get my mind right. I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a second, I swear I saw the shadow of a man standing on the side of the road. I blinked my eyes, and he disappeared. I was in shock, my heart was racing. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. What happened that night still haunts me. I never told anyone about the man, because I know no one would believe it. He disappeared into the darkness, as if he weren't real, but the terror of having been so close to something so inexplicable doesn't leave me alone. The roads have never been the same for me since then. And every time I drive at night, I feel like he's there, somewhere, waiting. Like he was an invisible presence, watching, and I never knew when he might appear again. The road, with its disconcerting silence, continues to torment me. To this day, when I pass those deserted roads, I keep looking at the shadows on the sides, hoping to see that man again, hoping he will return somehow. I could never understand what happened, and the truth is that I may never understand. All I know is that that night I found something on the road that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Something that is not explainable, something that should not have happened. But it happened. And try as I might, I can't forget the feeling of being watched by him, or whoever he was. The man on the road never completely goes away. It was one of those summer mornings where the heat seems to drag on for hours. I was driving along a rural road, one of those paths that cut through the interior of the country. The radio had no signal, so the only sound that accompanied my trip was the roar of the engine and the rustling of the trees on the side of the road. The landscape was too calm, perhaps even a little boring. Just the road and the fields around it. But then, the image I saw made me stop the truck instantly. There, near a wooden bridge that crossed a small river, there was a car parked. At the time, I didn't think it was anything out of the ordinary, until I saw what was happening. A normal-looking man was pulling something out of the car. I couldn't see exactly what it was, but the movement caught my attention. What happened next was a scene that disturbs me to this day. He pulled a man's body, throwing it into the river coldly and impersonally, without haste. As if that were the most normal thing in the world. The water swallowed the body in seconds. My heart raced instantly. I was paralyzed. The river was calm, reflecting the blue sky, and the sound of rushing water was the only noise after that. I didn't know what to do. If I stopped and called the police, I wouldn't have proof of anything, right? Just the words of a stranger in a truck, without even knowing what the man was doing or what had happened. There was no security camera there, and no witnesses other than me. The strangest thing is that, despite it being a horrific scene, there was no record of it in the local news. Nothing. I thought it was some kind of accident, something that could be easily explained. But something about the way he acted made me doubt any rational explanation. The coldness of the gesture, the total absence of remorse or emotion, it seemed wrong. But I didn't know if I had the right to do anything. He walked away from the river after throwing the body there and returned to his car, driving calmly down the road, as if nothing had happened. And I stood there, watching him disappear into the distance, not knowing if I should do something or just carry on with my life as if nothing had happened. I stood there for a few minutes, my mind racing, trying to process what I had just seen. What was that? A murder? An accident? I knew I had seen something serious, but at the same time, it seemed so surreal that I kept questioning myself the whole time. There was no way to prove anything. What if the body had actually fallen there by accident? What if the man was just trying to get rid of something? It didn't make sense, but what else could it be? I tried to convince myself that maybe I was exaggerating, that it was all just an error in perception, but I couldn't. Something inside me knew that this scene could not be ignored. That isolated road seemed even emptier after what I saw. I don't know how long I stood there, looking at the river, waiting for something to happen. But what made me leave was the feeling that, if I stayed longer, I could be drawn into something much bigger than I imagined. What should I do? Report? But how? I had no proof of anything. It was just a suspicion, a gesture that I saw, and nothing more. My mind was a whirlwind, a mix of fear, confusion, and the certainty that, somehow, I was now involved in something I could no longer ignore. I decided to continue my journey, but the image of the body falling into the water wouldn't leave my head. The rest of the day was a sequence of fragmented thoughts, and what bothered me most was the fact that I couldn't forget. I knew it was right to report it, but how can I report something without having proof? The river swallowed the body, and the currents would probably carry it away, but what would actually be left? I felt so helpless. I knew that if the police went there, they wouldn't find anything. What if I told you everything without proof? They would take me as crazy, as someone making up a story. Doubt consumed me. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I spent the morning thinking about what I saw, and the feeling that something very wrong was happening. There was nothing in the local news, no mention of a disappearance, accident or anything that explained what I had witnessed. The absence of any information only increased the weight of the situation. I wondered if I was just imagining it all, but the image of the body falling into the river was clear in my mind. It didn't matter how much I tried to deny it. I knew what I had seen, but the doubt, the lack of evidence, all of that left me helpless. Time passed and, no matter how much I tried to forget, the feeling that something terrible had happened that day never left me. The following weeks were torment. I watched the news every day, hoping to find some clue as to what happened. Nothing. What started as a feeling of discomfort turned into a constant fear, as if I were being watched. The man, the body, the river, it seemed like they were all still there, waiting for some answer. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find anything that could explain what I had seen. I started avoiding that path, that stretch of road where everything happened. Even during the day, when I passed by, a feeling of discomfort came over me, as if something invisible was watching me. I never saw the man again. I never heard anything again about what could have happened to the body in the river. But with each passing day, the certainty that I had witnessed something real, something profound and terrifying, only increased. The weight of what I saw never left my mind, and the fear that somehow I might be involved in something much bigger never went away. Sometimes I wondered if I was just making up stories for myself, trying to justify the anguish I felt. But whenever I closed my eyes, I remembered the body falling into the water, the sound of the water swallowing that human being. There was no way to ignore it. And, worse, what tormented me most was the idea that, perhaps, I was the only one who knew something that no one else would know. As if I had been a witness to a crime, but without proof, without a path forward, without answers. To this day, I wonder if anyone else saw what I saw. Was this man just getting rid of an accident or something much darker? And, if it was a crime, why was there no investigation? I never knew what happened, and the doubt continues to consume me. The body in the river disappeared, but the mystery stayed with me. And no matter how hard I try to move on, I can never shake the feeling that somehow this is all still happening, out there, without anyone knowing. It was one of those nights when the air felt thick and the silence on the road felt heavier than usual. I was driving across one of those narrow bridges, in the middle of an empty road, where the truck's lights couldn't illuminate even half the road ahead. There was no one, nothing but my loneliness and the continuous sound of tires hitting the asphalt. The radio had no signal, and all I could hear was the roar of the engine and the wind hitting the windows. The road seemed endless, and I was beginning to wonder what kept me going on these lonely journeys. That's when I saw her. There, on the edge of the bridge, in the darkness, a woman stood, staring at the river below. At first, I thought it was just an error in perception, maybe my mind starting to play tricks on me after so many hours on the road. But as I got closer, her figure became clear. She was wearing a simple outfit, but what shocked me most was the way she was standing still. It didn't seem to just be standing still, it seemed to be waiting for something. And that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what was going on, but my intuition told me the situation wasn't right. I stopped the truck a few meters from the bridge, the headlights still illuminating her figure. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know the woman, I didn't know what could be happening to her, but something about her posture, her stillness, made me feel a growing fear. She didn't seem scared, she didn't seem panicked, but there was a tension in the air, as if the bridge were a threshold, a place of decision. I wanted to get out of the truck, run to her, ask if everything was okay, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, or the fact that I didn't know how to handle the situation, but I stood there, motionless, watching as the woman seemed to be completely removed from any world around her. That feeling of helplessness was what disturbed me the most. I didn't know if I should intervene, but at the same time, a feeling that I shouldn't get involved came over me. What could I do? I was just a stranger, and maybe if I tried to help, it would be worse. The fear of doing something wrong paralyzed me. And, before I could make any decision, she slowly turned around, as if she had sensed my presence. I could see her eyes, the reflections of the truck's lights illuminating her face. But what struck me most was the emptiness in her eyes. There was no fear. There was no expression at all. It was as if she were somewhere else, as if she was already far away from everything, even herself. She stood there, staring at me for what seemed like an eternity. The silence between the two of us was almost palpable. There were no words, there was no movement. It was as if time had stopped. I felt like she knew I was there, watching, and that she didn't care. What was happening to her? I couldn't understand it, but the emptiness in her eyes made me uncomfortable. It seemed like she had already made a decision, that nothing there could change what she was about to do. I felt helpless, a witness who could not act. The weight of the situation was overwhelming. At that moment, my instinct told me to speed up and leave. But I couldn't. I knew something was wrong, that this moment couldn't be ignored, but at the same time, I didn't know what to do. The woman was still standing just a few feet from the edge of the bridge, and I couldn't stop thinking about how disturbing that was. The thought that she could just jump in at any moment made me feel increasing anguish. I tried to put on the handbrake, get out of the truck and run to her, but my body wouldn't respond. Fear paralyzed me, and all I could do was look, unable to help. She took a step back, moving slightly away from the edge. I felt a brief relief, as if she had changed her mind, but I soon realized that there was no longer a decision there. She was even further away from everything, further away from any possibility of help. I looked into his eyes once again, but there was no humanity left in them. It was as if she had already disconnected from the world. The fear that something was about to happen, something I couldn't stop, gripped me. And at that moment, without understanding what I was doing, I accelerated, headed towards the road again, without looking back. The feeling of having left the woman there, doing nothing, consumed me. It didn't matter how much I tried to justify my inaction. I knew something terrible could have happened on that bridge, and somehow I was still responsible for not doing more. Over the next few days, I returned to that bridge several times, walking across it and wondering what would have happened, if I would have made a difference if I had acted. But there was nothing. No clues. No news. The woman had disappeared, and with her, the feeling that something very wrong had happened there, something that I would never be able to explain. As time passed, the image of the woman on the bridge never left me. The road seemed emptier, quieter, as if what I had witnessed had left a mark, something irreparable. I tried to get on with my life, but every time I drove at night, the fear of crossing that bridge again haunted me. And, more than that, the emptiness in her eyes, the feeling that she had already said goodbye to the world, continued to torment me. I wondered what would have driven a person to that brink, what would have made them look into the abyss without fear, without regret. I returned to the city a few weeks later, and for the first time, I met someone who told me about the woman. But not in a way that was peaceful. One of the gas station attendants, when she saw me for the second time, commented on a rumor that was circulating. It seemed that, before disappearing, the woman had been seen by other drivers, always on the same bridge, always with the same silent posture. Some said it had been there for weeks. Others talked about the story of a woman who had lost everything, who had been abandoned by life and hope. I never knew what was true. The story about the woman on the bridge spread like a thick fog, but no one knew what really happened. Some said she was found, others swore she was never seen again. But, for me, the most distressing thing was not knowing what happened to her. What disturbed me most was the fact that even now, after so much time, I still felt as if she was watching me, as if her presence was still there, on that stretch of road, waiting. Waiting for someone to act, hoping for someone to really make a difference. I've never driven across that bridge again, but every time I drive at night, my gaze unconsciously turns to the dark corners of the road, as if I'm going to see her figure again, on the edge of the bridge, her eyes blank. The woman on the bridge became a ghost, an unsettling reminder of something I couldn't change. And as much as I try to move on, that moment, that vision, is still with me. Because deep down, I know that somehow she still hopes, and that something from that night will never be resolved.